Hi, welcome back to the basement. I'm Steve Lewis. We've arrived at the second quarter of 1964, the months of April, May, and June. This episode will talk about music and movies. Next time we'll get to the news, television, and what the Beach Boys were up to. So this episode will be very light on Beach Boy content. April 1964 opened with one of the most famous singles charts in music history. We'll get to that in just a moment. First, let's look at the top 10 albums as the quarter began on April 4th, 1964. That first chart of the quarter, sitting at number one, not surprisingly, was Meet the Beatles, in the eighth of what will eventually be 11 weeks at number one. When it finally drops to number two on May 2nd, it'll be behind the new Capitol release, The Beatles' second album. And number two was Introducing the Beatles on the VJ label. It was in the fifth of what will be 9 weeks at number two behind Meet the Beatles. At number three was Al Hirt's Honey in the Horn, in the fifth of what will be 8 weeks at its number three peak behind the two Beatle albums. At number four was the original cast recording of Hello Dolly. It'll reach number one on June 6th during a short break in Beatle releases. Barbra Streisand's The Third album was in the second of what will be 6 weeks at its number five peak. At number six was In the Wind by Peter, Paul, and Mary, still in the top 10 since November 2nd, 1963, when it had been at number one. Yesterday's Love Songs, Today's Blues by Nancy Wilson was at number 7. It had peaked at number 4 on March 14th. There, I've Said It Again by Bobby Vinton was in the second of 2 weeks at its number 8 peak. Peter, Paul, and Mary's 1962 self-titled debut album was at number 9. This album and In the Wind were the only two albums still in the top 10 from the beginning of the year. In fact, Peter, Paul, and Mary was still at number 9 at the beginning of the year. And rounding out the top 10 was Henry Mancini's soundtrack to the film Charade. It'll peak at number 6 the next week, April 11th. And now let's move on to that very famous April 4th, 1964 top 10 singles chart. Famous because it was the first time in history that all top 5 spots were held by one act. And at number one was the Beatles with their new single, Can't Buy Me Love. It had just arrived at number one in its second week on the chart and will stay there for 5 weeks. The Beatles' Twist and Shout had just hit its number 2 peak and will stay at number 2 for 4 weeks. As you'll see here, the Beatles' first US hits were on a number of small labels in addition to their official EMI-owned label, Capitol. As part of EMI, Capitol had the right to release the Beatles records, but Until I Want to Hold Your Hand kept passing on them, allowing small labels to pick them up. When the Beatles broke in the US, VJ, their subsidiary label Tolly, and Swan Records all found their obscure English rock records suddenly in huge demand. At number 3 was the Beatles' She Loves You. It had been number 1 for the prior 2 weeks. At number 4 was I Want to Hold Your Hand. It had been number 1 on February 1st, 1964, shortly before the Beatles' arrival in America, and had stayed there for 7 weeks before being replaced by She Loves You. In the number 5 spot was the Beatles' Please Please Me. It had spent 2 weeks at number 3, beginning March 14th. At number 6 was a non-Beatle record, Suspicion, Terry Stafford's cover of a track from Elvis Presley's 1962 Potluck album, done in Elvis's style. It'll manage to rise to number 3 for 2 weeks, beginning the next week, April 11th. At number 7 was Louis Armstrong's Hello Dolly. This will go to number 1 on May 9th, the first record by anybody besides the Beatles to go to number 1 in more than 3 months. Betty Everett's Shoop Shoop song, It's in His Kiss, was at number 8. It'll go to number 6 for 2 weeks, beginning the next week, April 11th. Bobby Vinton's My Heart Belongs to Only You was in the second of its 2 weeks at its number 9 peak. And at number 10 was the Dave Clark 5 with Glad All Over. As we mentioned in part 2, at the time, the Dave Clark 5 were undoubtedly the second most successful of the still rapidly emerging British invasion groups in the US. This was the first of what will eventually be 7 top 20 hits for them in 1964. It'll peak at number 6 on April 25th. The Beatles' feat of having all 5 top 10 singles this week will remain unequaled for nearly 60 years, until, in very different times, streaming will allow Drake to have 9 of the top 10 hits and Taylor Swift to hold all spots in the top 10. Singles that came and went in that second quarter of 1964 included Don't Let the Rain Come Down, Crooked Little Man by the Serendipity Singers, which will go to number 6 for 2 weeks beginning May 2nd. Bits and Pieces by the Dave Clark 5 will go to number 4 for 3 weeks beginning May 2nd. The Beatles' Do You Want to Know a Secret on the VJ label will go to number 2 on May 9th. And Jan and Dean's single version of Dead Man's Curve, written by Jan Berry, Roger Christian, Artie Kornfeld, and Brian Wilson, will go to number 8 for 2 weeks beginning May 9th. My Guy by Mary Wells will go to number 1 for 2 weeks beginning May 16th. Ronnie by the Four Seasons will go to number 6 on May 16th. South African singer Danny Williams will have his only US hit with White on White, which will go to number 8 on May 16th. Little Children by Billy J. Kramer and the Dakotas will hit number 7 on May 23rd. It's their first, and as it would turn out, biggest US hit, and the only one of the 4 to eventually hit the US top 40, not written by fellow Liverpudlians Lennon and McCartney. Roy Orbison's It's Over will hit number 9 for 2 weeks beginning May 23rd. On May 30th, the Beatles' Love Me Do on Tolly will hit number 1. And the Reflections, Just Like Romeo and Juliet, will hit number 6 on May 30th. P.S. I Love You, the B-side of Love Me Do, will reach number 10 on June 8th. Love Me With All of Your Heart by the Ray Charles Singers will hit number 3 on June 13th. One listen and you will know for sure it is not that Ray Charles. Walk On By, a second top 10 for Dionne Warwick, and another one written by Burt Bacharach and Hal David, will go to number 6 for 2 weeks beginning June 13th. And Diane by The Bachelors will go to number 10 on June 20th. It's the first and biggest US hit for the Irish pop vocal trio. Big new album releases in that second quarter included the companion album to Elvis's new movie Kissin' Cousins, released on April 2nd. It'll peak at number 6 for 3 weeks beginning May 2nd. On April 10th, Capitol released the Beatles' second album. VJ had Introducing the Beatles, but Capitol definitely was not counting it. Also released in April was Barbra Streisand and the original Broadway cast's album of Funny Girl. The Academy Award-winning Call Me Irresponsible album by Andy Williams. And Something Special for Young Lovers by the Ray Charles Singers. May brought the release of Louis Armstrong's Hello Dolly album. Today, Tomorrow, Forever by Nancy Wilson. Al Hirt following up his hit album Honey in the Horn with Cotton Candy. And on May 30th, the US debut of another English group, England's newest hit makers, the Rolling Stones, or as they often seem to have been called at this early stage of their career, at least in the US, the Rolling Stones. In June, we got the release of the Dave Clark 5 Return, their second US studio album. It'll hit number 5 on July 18th. It featured a nice, colorful album cover that seemed to point the way toward things to come. Also in June, the concert sound of Henry Mancini, which will go to number 15 late in the summer, and the original soundtrack album of the unsinkable Molly Brown, which will go to number 11 late in the summer. And on June 25th came the release of the Beatles' A Hard Day's Night album. In the UK, the album was comprised of 11 new Lennon and McCartney songs, plus the recently released single, Can't Buy Me Love and You Can't Do That, making it the first and, as it would transpire, only original album completely written by Lennon and McCartney. In the US, the album was released by United Artists instead of Capitol. United Artists' parent company owned the rights to the film, which gave them the right to release songs included on the soundtrack. It contained the 7 songs from the first side of the UK album, which were featured in the movie, plus I'll Cry Instead, which had been planned for the movie but cut at the last minute. The album was padded out with adult-oriented arrangements of Beatles songs arranged and conducted by George Martin. Possibly unsure how quickly the Beatles' bubble would burst, possibly trying to get the sales jump on Capitol, or possibly both, United Artists released the soundtrack a month and a half before the US release of the Beatles film. Of course, Beetlemania rolled on and merchandising was ramping up rapidly. There were Beatle wigs, Beatle dolls, Beatle sneakers, Beatle rings, Beatle wallets, Beatle buttons. I especially like the description of the buttons as action-packed. I've got one of these, and as you can see, it's action-packed all right. Sometimes the excitement keeps me up at night. There were Beatle beach blankets, a Beatles game, Beatles tumblers and travel cases, Beatle ice cream bars. In the fall, there would be Beatle Halloween costumes, and there were lots of Beatle magazines, of course. course, there was plenty more besides. We barely scratched the surface here. Suffice to say, pretty much if you could slap the word Beatle on it, somebody was willing to make it and merchandise it. One of the real impressions that you get looking at this period is how everybody from the lowest end merchandiser really all the way up to Capitol Records seemed really concerned that the Beatles could flop at any moment. They might last 6 months, they might even stay popular for a couple of years, but nobody wanted to take the risk of snoozing and losing. They wanted to get that merchandise out and get that money in as quickly as possible. Not surprisingly, the Beatles quickly found their way onto bubblegum cards. I happen to have the second and third series of the Beatle bubblegum cards from 1964. These were actually given to me in 1977 by my high school English teacher, which kind of makes me wish I'd been nicer to the guy. As you can see, they're black and white photos of the group either together or individually. Some are landscape style, some are portrait style. One of the things that really surprised me about these is the backs are almost completely blank. They just have a little stamp on them that tells the series and the card number. And even in these days, usually there was some kind of narrative on the back of a bubblegum card, or maybe a picture that you could assemble as a puzzle if you got the whole set, something like that. I think that's an indication that these were made very quickly and they wanted to get them out into the stores as fast as possible. Anyway, thought you might enjoy seeing those. Now let's talk about movies in the second quarter of 1964. Released on April 5th of this election year was The Best Man, a drama with one highly principled candidate and one ruthless and amoral candidate vying for their party's presidential nomination. It starred Henry Fonda and Cliff Robertson. Not surprisingly, the principled one is Henry Fonda. And Bond was back in the second James Bond film, From Russia with Love, which opened in New York on April 8th. Once again, as with the Beatles, the Americans were slightly late to the party. The film had been playing in the UK and parts of Europe since the fall of 1963. Like the first film, it'll be a hit, and a successful film franchise will take off. On April 9th came The Carpetbaggers, another 1964 film with lots of stars sharing prominent billing. In this case, the cast included George Peppard, Bob Cummings, Martha Heyer, and Alan Ladd, who had passed away a little over 2 months earlier on January 29th. It'll be number 1 for 5 weeks beginning June 17th and again for the week of July 29th. On May 6th came the release of AIP's film adaptation of Richard Matheson's I Am Legend. The Last Man on Earth was set in the post-apocalyptic future of 1968, starring a miscast Vincent Price in a U.S.-Italian co-production. Even AIP seemed to recognize that the role of a zombie-fighting apocalypse survivor wasn't a natural fit for Vincent Price. The movie advertising featured a haunted house and a ghostly female figure, making it look more like one of AIP's successful Edgar Allan Poe films featuring Vincent Price. On May 14th, What a Way to Go, a new comedy with, you guessed it, a big all-star cast. This one starred Shirley MacLaine, Paul Newman, Robert Mitchum, Dean Martin, Gene Kelly, Bob Cummings again, and Dick Van Dyke. The comedy in this will make you long for the gentle understatement of Jerry Lewis. It'll be number 1 for the week of May 27th. On May 20th, Viva Las Vegas, the second Elvis Presley movie of the year and one of his best remembered, largely due to the fact that for once he had a memorable co-star, in this case Anne Margaret. Its opening came just in time for drive-in season. Weirdly, this was one Elvis Presley film that didn't have a soundtrack album. On May 21st, The Chalk Garden, a drama starring Haley Mills as the 16 and outrageous Laurel, and Deborah Kerr as the mysterious Miss Madrigal, the governess hired to tame her. It'll be number 1 the week of June 3rd. Released on June 11th was The Unsinkable Molly Brown, starring Debbie Reynolds and Harve Personnel in a musical comedy based extremely loosely on the life of Margaret Molly Brown, early 20th century socialite and survivor of the Titanic. It'll be number 1 for the weeks of July 2nd, August 5th, and for 6 weeks from August 19th to September 30th. On June 23rd came the release of Blake Edwards' A Shot in the Dark, the second in the Pink Panther series, coming only about 6 months after the original Pink Panther had premiered in the US. It of course starred Peter Sellers along with Elke Summer and will be number 1 for 3 weeks beginning September 30th. On June 24th came the release of The Mask of the Red Death, the 7th of 8 Roger Corman films for AIP based extremely loosely on the works of Edgar Allan Poe. It starred Vincent Price in a role that suited him much better than the more action-oriented Last Man on Earth. And also on June 24th, following on from Ocean's 11's Sergeants 3 and 4 for Texas, came Robin and the Seven Hoods, starring Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, and Sammy Davis Jr. with Bing Crosby. So that's where we'll leave it for now. Next time we will return to wrap up the first half of the very eventful year of 1964. Hope you enjoyed this. I do look forward to your comments as always. Please hit like if you don't mind and subscribe if you haven't. Hope you have a great week. Looking forward to next time. Thanks again. Bye.